Hello, everyone. I have the great privilege of introducing Bernie today because I got to know Bernie when I went to school at St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota. I was in the School of Theology there. Bernie and I had wonderful conversations about the work and vision of Virgil Michael, who was really the pioneer of the modern liturgical movement in the United States. So I remember with great fondness, Bernie, those conversations we had that really inspired me in so many ways for my own work. And Bernie, I don't know if you remember this, but you were also the person that introduced me to Ray Kemp. So
Oh,
I don't, so over the years, I'm not sure whether to thank you for that or what, but of course, Ray Kemp has become a good friend as well. So Bernie worked for a number of years with Peace Corps. You were with Peace Corps. You were with the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, which is part of the U.S. Bishops' Conference, which is where he also got to know Walt Grazer, who is on our meeting today as well. So they're colleagues from back when. And then Bernie went to St. John's, where he held the Virgil Michael Ecumenical Chair in Rural Social Ministries. And he just retired from St. John's last year?
3 years ago, actually.
3 years ago. And recently, I'm going to boast for a minute, Bernie. Bernie wrote the introduction to this little book called Liturgy and Ministry in Times of Need, which I also contributed to. So Bernie, it was such a source of joy for me to be in the same book as you. Right? That we both contributed to the same volume. So welcome again to Holy Trinity. We're really happy to have you here today.
Thank you, Anne. I really appreciate that. You're very kind. It's good to be on the program with you after so many years after you were at the School of Theology in St. John's. And I've always appreciated the work that you've been doing, especially in the area of liturgy and justice. And I hope that can continue. So thank you. And thank you, Ashley, for inviting me to be part of this. I've really been looking forward to it. Partly it brings back such good memories for me of living in the DC area and working, as Anne said, for 10 years with the Campaign for Human Development during its first 10 years of existence. That was just an exciting and wonderful experience. And so it's nice to be connected with Holy Trinity in Georgetown and DC now, and to see my friend Walt Grazer here as well. Okay, so I was asked to speak about voting from a Catholic perspective, and I recognize there are different ways to approach this. I am going to be working this or talking especially or basing my remarks mainly on Catholic social teachings with some references to the bishop's document on voting. Different times I'll be bringing that in. But the question I'm trying to address here is, how do we approach our responsibility to vote in the most informed way possible and in a way that reflects our Catholic values? As you know, the bishops every 4 years before the presidential election issue a document, or they have for several decades anyway, called with the words faithful citizenship in the document. The last 3 of them have been called forming consciences for faithful citizenship. And so I'd like to just offer a couple of comments about the role of a well-formed conscience as we prepare to vote, because it is an important part of what we're doing. In forming and following our conscience, we recognize that our decisions and moral choices are not isolated acts separated from our spiritual growth and our journey of faith. We recognize, pardon me, that our life is about responding to God's invitation to be loving persons and to live in deep relationship with God. And so our conscience guiding these decisions and choices and actions is part of that journey to seek God and to have our lives align with God's expectations. The political process, including our voting, is part of that journey. And from a Catholic perspective, we need to put our conscience to work as we engage this process and work to decide how we're going to vote. Finally, there's one beautiful statement about conscience that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but I love it, from the Second Vatican II, Vatican Council, Gaudium et Spes, Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, number 16, quote, "Conscience is the most secret core and sanctuary of a person. There one is alone with God, whose voice echoes within us," unquote. And this is a conscience we must follow. So, voting from a Catholic perspective, there are several points from Catholic social teaching for us to consider here. One of the most important, I think, is that we focus on the common good. And the meaning of the common good is really pretty simple. The Second Vatican Council described it as the sum of all those conditions of social life by which individuals, families, groups can achieve their own fulfillment. In other words, it's all those things that we need for a reasonably decent life: food, clothing, shelter, education, practice of religion, healthcare, and the bigger items: jobs, infrastructure, roads, safe environment. The common good constitutes all those things that you and I, on a daily basis, take for granted, that we should have, that we will have, if we're going to have a reasonably dignified life. And there is a religious basis to this notion of the common good in Catholic thinking. And very simply, it is that we are a people. We're not isolated individuals, but we are a people. And again, that same document from the Second Vatican Council, Gaudium et Spes, puts it very beautifully. It has pleased God to make us holy and save us, not merely as individuals without mutual bonds, but by making us into a single people. It has pleased God to make us holy and to save us. That's not news, we know that. But God chooses to do that, to save us and to make us holy, by forming us into a people. And so we're on a shared journey. We go to God together, and along the way, we look out for one another. I was so happy to see in Pope Francis' new encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, that at least twice, I've read the whole document, but now I have to go back and study it, but I remember at least twice, he makes the statement, no one is saved alone. And so this is a common good focus, that we are a people, that we're responsible for one another, that we're not just concerned about our individual concerns, but about community interests. It's not just about asking what's in it for me, but how will it help the larger community. This common good focus recognizes that as individuals, we will do well when everyone does well. So this religious basis for the common good, this recognition that we are a people, reminds us that in promoting the common good, we are to care especially for those who have great needs. In Catholic social teaching, This is referring to the preferential option for the poor. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But it's very deeply rooted in the scriptures. So many of Jesus' actions and parables make this point, perhaps none better than the parable of the Last Judgment in Matthew 25. I was hungry, thirsty, a stranger, naked, sick, in prison, and you'd looked after me. Therefore, enter into the kingdom. And of course, the reverse is there too. Because you didn't attend to me when I was in these conditions, you will not enter the kingdom. This is more than encouragement to help persons with great needs. It is also a warning that our that our willingness to help or to not help people who are poor and vulnerable is a criterion for entry into the kingdom. And whenever I hear this or read this parable, I am reminded also of the early Christian writers in the 3rd, 4th century, where they sometimes made the point that the poor are our best defenders and our strongest accusers. Not that they themselves defend or accuse, but that God sees what we do or do not do for those who are poor and holds us accountable. The poor are our best defenders and strongest accusers. So the religious or theological basis for the common good from a Christian perspective is that we are a people and we are responsible for one another. And this is the perspective we find in the Hebrew tradition and the Jewish scriptures as well. If you think of the prophets always addressing the people and calling them to task, warning them, the people, that your relationship with Yahweh is broken. And one of the signs of this is that you are not caring for the widows, the orphans, and the strangers. We see this also in the Muslim tradition, the third of the Abrahamic faiths. In the 7th century, the Prophet Muhammad spoke about the Ummah, attempting to establish the Ummah in Medina, which would be a holy and just community, a community in which nobody would have any needs, all would be cared for. And many years ago, as a Peace Corps volunteer in Turkey, in the town I was living in and working in Yenişehir, I was so impressed at how the people there, all of them Muslims, cared for those in the community who had needs, the poor in their community. And as a young 24-year-old at the time, who presumed that we Catholics had an absolute monopoly on being charitable and helping people, I was very impressed by what I saw the Muslim Turks doing there in Yenişehir, the common good. So how do we contribute to the common good? We do so obvious ways through working, volunteering, paying taxes, raising our children to be good citizens, being good citizens ourselves, not destroying other people's political yard signs at this time of the year, which has become a little too common here in rural Minnesota, but also doing what we can to heal divisions in a terribly fragmented society. And we contribute to the common good through our voting. In Faithful Citizenship, the bishops state, quote, how we organize our society in economics and politics, in law and policy, directly affects the common good and the capacity of individuals to develop their full potential, unquote. And we control that by electing the right people to public office. So when we talk about voting and the common good, I think two primary questions should be in front of us. One, what are the needs of society or the community at this time? And two, which candidates do we think will work to meet those needs? And so first, looking at the needs of the society, the issues. This is about making our best judgment on what are the greatest issues or needs that we face. And this is a process of discerning. And we're going to have different views on this, and that's all right. And that's why we have political parties. But as Catholics, we're asked to give special attention to two areas in particular. The first, people who are poor and vulnerable, and the second, protecting human life and promoting human dignity. First, the poor and the vulnerable. As I indicated earlier, in Catholic social teaching, we talk about the preferential option for the poor. We first heard about this in a document from Pope Paul VI in 1971, A Call to Action, number 23, where he wrote, "The gospel instructs us in the preferential respect due to the poor and the special situation they have in society." And again, this is rooted in the scriptures. Jesus' actions, his parables, like the Last Judgment parable, like the Good Samaritan parable. We see it's rooted also in the prophetic literature. They're concerned always for the widows, the orphans, and the strangers, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Micah. And even in the prophetic literature, we see the connection between worship and justice, such as in Amos chapter 5. I despise your festivals. I don't want to hear your singing. I do not want your incense to come to me anymore, but let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. So there are some practical challenges that come with this preferential option for the poor. It is more than a theoretical kind of abstract thing. There's some very practical dimensions to it. It means, of course, that we do more than offer direct services and actions of charity. It means now that we have to be engaged in changes to systems, laws, policies, and programs. But the question is, which changes should we support? And here the preferential option for the poor tells us that we should support those changes, those systemic, institutional, legal, policy changes that we think will bring the greatest benefits to those persons with the greatest needs. That's the option for the poor. For example, with healthcare reform, there are usually several options being considered, several pieces of legislation related to healthcare reform that are under consideration in Congress. The option for the poor encourages us to support that piece of legislation, that particular reform that we think will most benefit those with the greatest needs, even if it's not always clear to us how it will benefit us directly. Likewise, the homeless, that issue, to support changes, proposals that we think are going to be of the greatest benefit to those with the greatest needs for housing, whether purchasing or renting, even if it might require that future affordable housing will be put in all communities. And climate change, another example. Number one, recognizing the severity of it, but responding globally to poor populations, especially living in coastal areas facing rising sea levels, like the people in the Maldives or the Cataract Islands in the South Pacific. All of these topics, though related to the social, economic, and political spheres of our lives, are concerns for the church and for anyone who claims to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. They are our concerns because all of these topics impact, for good or for bad, people's development as spiritually mature and morally responsible persons. These issues have an impact on our growth in those areas. Pope Benedict XVI, in his encyclical God is Love, number 22, offered this thought on the topic, quote, "Love for widows and orphans, prisoners, and the sick and needy of every kind is as essential to the church as the ministry of the sacraments and the preaching of the gospel," unquote. As essential to the church as the ministry of the sacraments and the preaching of the gospel. In Catholic social teaching, all of these needs, topics, issues relate to the common good and to human rights. And so as we prepare to vote, we should be looking for candidates who are willing to address such issues and needs with measures that especially benefit people living on the margins of society. That is a necessary part of promoting the common good. And a second area to which Catholics are asked to give special attention as we prepare to vote is the defense of human life and the promotion of human dignity. First, to resist direct attacks against human life. We know this. We know what the examples are, such as abortion, capital punishment, euthanasia, and more. But also in more recent developments of Catholic social teaching, there's an increasing concern about war, and the teaching urging us to recognize war itself as an attack on human life. Even as we recognize that in the Catholic tradition, there is the allowance for a just war, but we're urged in stronger and stronger terms to seek alternative ways to resolve conflict and maintain peace, and not be too anxious to support a move towards war. Two examples. We saw that especially in the 1983 document from the U.S. Catholic bishops, The Challenge of Peace, God's Promise, and Our Response. And now we see it in Pope Francis' most recent encyclical, where in number 258, he states that today it is very difficult to invoke criteria from the past to speak of the possibility of a just war. Very difficult to invoke the just war criteria. Second, not only are we to defend human life against direct attacks, but we're also to promote human dignity for everyone. And again, we do this by promoting the common good, by working to make sure that everyone has what is needed for a dignified life. But protecting human life and promoting human dignity, it is important to recognize that these two go together. It is not only about defending a person's right to be born. It is also about promoting the conditions for a dignified life after that birth has occurred and throughout a person's entire life. That too is promoting the common good, and that is what it means to be pro-life. So when candidates claim the pro-life crown, we should ask what that means to them. If it doesn't include feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, welcoming the stranger, clothing the naked, visiting the imprisoned, and attending to the sick, they are not pro-life. If that sounds a little harsh, please note what some of our church leaders have said. Bishop John Stowe, Lexington, Kentucky, quote, "We can't claim to be pro-life if we support the separation of children from their parents at the US border. If we support exposing people at the border to COVID-19 because of the facilities that they're in. If we support denying people who have need for adequate healthcare access to healthcare. If we keep people from getting the housing or education that they need, we cannot call ourselves pro-life," unquote. And Bishop Stowe was reflecting on the writing of Pope Francis in his apostolic exhortation, Rejoice and Be Glad, number 101, where the Holy Father says, quote, "Our defense of the innocent unborn, for example, needs to be clear, firm, and passionate. For at stake is the dignity of a human life, which is always sacred and demands love for each person, regardless of his or her stage of development. Equally sacred, however, are the lives of the poor, those already born, the destitute, the abandoned, and the underprivileged, the vulnerable, infirm, and elderly exposed to covert euthanasia, the victims of human trafficking, new forms of slavery, and every form of rejection," unquote. All human life is sacred, and our efforts to promote the common good and to build a just society must attend to those persons in the womb, and equally so to those struggling to survive outside the womb. So in addressing the needs of society, we're asked to pay particular attention to the poor and the vulnerable, and to protecting human life and promoting human dignity. But to do that effectively, we must consider all the issues. However important we feel one or two issues may be, whether that's climate change, abortion, racism, healthcare, we must look at them all. A first point in considering all the issues is to ask which ones are important now and for this election. Some issues are especially urgent at this time, some are less so, and some are always urgent. But at this time, we need to ask which ones rise above the others. And our backgrounds and experiences will influence our judgments, our choices on these questions. And so it's important, I think, to recognize the legitimate differences among us, and important to see that this is a discernment process about the issues, and it is part of our following a well-formed conscience. A second point, as we consider all the issues, is to recognize that not all issues are equal. In Catholic teaching and in the bishop's writings, some issues and actions are always wrong, we must never do, can never be justified, must always be opposed, the language that the bishops use in faithful citizenship. For example, it is never justified to intentionally take an innocent human life, such as abortion. It is always wrong to make a direct assault on innocent human life, such as genocide, torture, targeting of non-combatants. It is always wrong, also always wrong, to engage in acts of racism, treating workers as mere means to an end, and treating poor people as disposable. But there are many other issues important to the common good, and therefore must also be considered, like immigration, like healthcare, like affordable housing. The bishops very clearly in number 37 tell us that all issues do not carry the same moral weight. Nonetheless, they ask us to avoid two temptations. One, the temptation of seeing no distinctions between issues, and two, the temptation of using these moral distinctions as a reason to ignore other threats to human life and human dignity. And so they state in number 43, as Catholics, we are not single issue voters. So as we prepare to vote, we evaluate candidates on the positions they take on these many issues of differing moral importance. And this can get messy. And so again, the importance of a well-formed conscience. In faithful citizenship, the bishops offer two interesting and I think helpful statements about this. The first, a Catholic cannot vote for a candidate who favors policies promoting acts that are always wrong, like abortion or torture or racism, if our intent is to support that position. It's number 34. And their second statement, there may be times when a Catholic rejects a candidate's unacceptable position on policies promoting acts that are always wrong, like racism or abortion, but may reasonably decide to vote for the candidate for other morally grave reasons. Number 35. What might be some otherly morally grave reasons? Two examples. A candidate favors policies promoting abortion, but recognizes the seriousness of climate change and seems committed to leading our nation in addressing it, or committed to treating immigrants and refugees in a humane way. Another example, a candidate who ignores climate change and supports capital punishment also takes a strong stand against abortion. We might want to talk more about those two statements from the bishop in our discussion time shortly. So in preparing to vote, we look at the needs of society, and then we look at the candidates, keeping in mind that we are not voting for the issues, but we're voting for candidates. In general, we ask, or should be asking, about candidates, who do we think is most likely to work for, contribute to the common good? More specifically, we might ask several questions. One, where are they on the issues? Especially issues that, in my conscience, I think are extremely important. How willing are they to make their positions known? And that can be a critical point, especially today when television ads and other commercials from candidates most often are not about where they are on issues, but are aimed at showing the shortcomings of their opponent. Second question, what office is he or she running for? What issues is this office able or likely to address? If the candidate is running, for example, for a state office, I should not judge this candidate on whether he or she supports my positions on issues only dealt with at the federal level, like making improvements to the Affordable Care Act, or like certain aspects of the immigration law. A third question, does he or she have the necessary skills to get the job done? I think it's really important that we look at this. Is she competent? Is he intelligent? Does she possess human relation skills? Is he open to compromise? There is no point in electing a saintly person who is right on the issues, but lacks skills and the competence to work on them. That is not advancing the common good. And the fourth question, what about character? I know we have to be careful on this and not demand that every candidate think or act like I do. But character does matter. It sets the tone for the country, especially if we're talking about a candidate for high office. And a candidate can imprint that character upon the entire political culture and therefore on our society itself. And I would argue that granting a buy for bad personal behavior often invites bad behavior in terms of state and national policies and in terms of relations our nation has in all directions, including those on the global scene. Finally, a couple of comments about our responsibilities as voters. I think, and we all know this, know our values. What moral compass guides us? What role does our faith play in our political decisions? How well do we know our Catholic teaching on voting and public policy? How well do we know Catholic social teaching? Secondly, know the issues. It's an ongoing challenge to keep informed year-round. But if we do that, if we make that effort, it won't be so difficult at the time of elections. Okay? Know the candidates. Again, this can be a challenge, but I think it's important that we don't be blocked by extreme partisanship or vicious campaigns or by presidential debates that are less than helpful. I think a good reflective reading of Pope Francis' newest encyclical can be helpful to us on that. And finally, vote and stay engaged politically. Voting is a moral responsibility, and I think we should vote, even if we sometimes feel that there's no candidate that measures up to my ideals. There is no perfect candidate, and there is no perfect voter. As John Carr recently wrote in America Magazine, that there is no perfect political party. He talks about being politically homeless. I think it's an excellent article and a good example of how to navigate some of the things that the bishops are saying in their document. But we do need to vote. I regret that the bishops in their documents say there may be times when you have that, take the option of not voting. I think we have to struggle with it. I think we have to vote. If we're not able to do it, it might be an indication that we're focusing too much on one or two issues. And engage politically throughout the year. Connect with others. You have so many resources in your geographical area. Holy Trinity Parish, Social Justice Ministry, and some very creative programs you have. Women Who Stay. For example, you have the Archdiocesan Office of Social Concerns, the National Conference of Bishops, and Georgetown University. Tremendous resources that for which I envy all of you. Being out in rural areas, we do not have resources such as that. So I'd strongly urge you to take advantage of that. So in preparing to vote from a Catholic perspective, just to review 3 quick points: focus on the common good. And within that focus on the common good, give particular attention to persons who are poor and vulnerable, and defend human life and promote human dignity. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernie. We do have some questions in the chat, so I'm going to just start with those. The first one is, how can you explain, we have a couple of this one. How can you explain being pro-choice but still being a Catholic? The person indicates that they get questioned by more conservative Catholics on this issue and struggles to answer it.
Well, my answer would be that I would like to know what they mean by pro-choice, because I think when that question is asked, it very often means that the person is asking about being anti-abortion. And I think that if we recognize that being pro-choice means being certainly anti-abortion, but also means being anti the death penalty, means being pro working to make sure that people have what they need for a dignified life through all their life, all of those things that I mentioned in the talk. If we see that as being the way to define or describe pro-life, then it's, to me, not a problem to vote for a candidate who may be pro-choice on the abortion issue, but is also very pro-life in so many other ways. I think it comes down to whether or not we can expand that definition of pro-life beyond being anti-abortion.
Another participant wrote that they find it difficult to use those values outlined in the bishop's document and come out with one answer for a vote. Can you enlighten us on how half of U.S. Catholics can come to a different conclusion?
Different from the bishops?
Yes.
I'm not sure I understand what in the document they're specifically referring to. Might it have been I'm sorry.
That's okay. I was going to say, Bob, I mean, we're smaller. Bob, do you want to, not to call you out if you're trying not to say who it was, but do you want to clarify?
Thank you, Kathleen, and thank you, Bernard. I'm specifically referring to the sections you quoted, to 34 through 36, where you're asking, the bishops are asking us to weigh not just single issues, but all the issues. And when I think I mistyped, when I try to do that, I come out on one side of our current choices. And I don't understand how people would use those same principles and come out on the other side. And that's what I'm looking for some enlightenment on.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure I have a good answer for you, but what comes to mind is 2 quick things. One is that we have different experiences. We're coming from different places, and those experiences will, I think, always influence what seems urgent or what seems to be a priority for us in terms of the issues that we end up focusing on. And secondly, our conscience is going to not always take us in the same direction, take us in the same place, to the same conclusion in terms of the issues. The bishops do tell us to look at all the issues, and within that, to make some judgment about which issues at this time, in this place, and for this election, we think should govern or have the most influence on how we decide to vote. And they're not naming any one or two issues that have to have that priority. They do. I should back off on that, because with this document this time around, it's the same as the previous one, but they issued a new cover letter with it. And they do make in that letter, they say that, again, what's their language? Preeminent priority is abortion. But that has been questioned by a lot of people, including some bishops, as to whether or not, and I would argue that it's very difficult to say that Catholic social teaching would name any one issue as the preeminent issue that we should focus on. To do that is to, it seems to me, collapse Catholic social teaching into that one issue. And so I think our church's teachings are best when they recognize that there are a number of very serious issues. But be careful of saying there has to be one issue. When you do that, you're saying that Catholics have to line up behind that one issue.
We have a question. What can you explain, or do you have any thoughts on the majority support of Catholics for President Trump, given his positions that are consistently anti-immigrant, anti-poor, anti-healthcare for those with pre-existing conditions?
Well, I think just going with some of the surveys that I've seen, the Pew Research, for example, that oftentimes the Catholics supporting Trump are doing so primarily because of the issue of abortion and the appointment of judges to the Supreme Court who may have an impact on that issue. I'm thinking in terms of people thinking about Roe versus Wade. But again, I think it's unfortunate that so many Catholics think that use the language of pro-life in describing this president because of what he's done on the appointment of judges relative to the abortion issue. I think it's most unfortunate that we, in our culture, that we have let pro-life be narrowed down to this one issue. Because if we recognize what the words mean to be pro-life, both for birth and for dignified life until death, one could seriously question whether their candidate is pro-life. And I would agree certainly with Bishop Stowe on that if you separate children from their parents at the border, that's hardly being pro-life. But I think, to be summarized, to answer the question, why do so many Catholics support this candidate when he has done some things that clearly are not pro-life? I think it is their very narrow definition of being pro-life.
Do you think criminalizing abortions will end abortion?
No, I do not think it will. And I think we should think, however wherever we stand on Roe versus Wade, I don't think we should see that as the only way to work on ending or limiting or restricting abortions. We don't talk enough about the fact that the last numbers I saw on this showed about half of the women who have abortions are low income. And for many of them, they're making that choice because they feel, if I'm reading the information correctly, that they can't afford it. And that would lead me to think, well, what can we do as a society then to make sure that programs and support are in place to encourage people to have the children and know that they will be supported as they're raising their children. And that's another area we should be looking at, and not just focus on this one Supreme Court issue.
Why do you think the Catholic Church is indicated by the bishop's letter you just mentioned? Why does it focus so exclusively on abortion over all these other issues?
Well, I think, in my lifetime, it has always done that. And it is a serious issue. The church defines the fetus as human life. And to end a human life is, or as I talked about earlier, having a direct attack upon innocent human life is wrong. That from the beginning has been the church's position on that in modern times, at least. So that's clear to me why the bishops are so strong on that. What I wish the bishops could do would be, however, to guide us in seeing that there are other equally important human life issues, such as those that I mentioned earlier in my remarks, and not continue to feed the stream here of holding up this one issue as over and above all the others. It just does not work in terms of Catholic social teaching. And unfortunately, I don't think most of the bishops are seeing it that way.
That's all the questions I have in the chat. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask before we have a few more minutes?
I have one. I'd like to ask Bernie to repeat something that he said in an earlier Zoom session that I attended. And it deals with the process of discerning, which Bernie today has given us a very good example of how to discern in very complex process. And I believe it was Bishop McElroy made the point that one of the things where Catholic education has failed has been in the area of the art of discernment. And it does take the kind of effort that Bernie and others have put into it. So Bernie, could you talk briefly about, beginning with a statement that shocked me a couple of days ago, when you said that only 25% of Catholic seminaries teach social justice, which basically would go into much of the process which Bernie talks about today. Bernie, could you talk about that just a little bit?
Sure. Actually, it was that figure comes from some work I did on a bishop's task force in the 1990s, a task force on Catholic social teaching and Catholic education. And the subcommittee that I worked on in that task force was looking at what seminaries and major seminaries and schools of theology were doing in teaching Catholic social teachings. And we found that only 25% of the seminaries were doing anything at all with Catholic social teachings, only 25%. And of those, only a few had seminarians actually exposed to and reading Catholic social documents. So my point at that time, Father Jim, was to, I was responding to a question from somebody about why are Catholics so poorly informed on their church's social teachings. And my point then, and I would stress it now, is that it's in part, at least, because their local leaders, the clergy, are not very well informed on their own church's social teachings. I know that may sound harsh, but I think the data is pretty clear.
I'll give a little shout out to Holy Trinity because my 7th grade son is actually at school now taking a test about Catholic social
All
teaching.
right.
I've been trying to explain it all week, so yay, Holy Trinity. But
I want to,
anyway.
can I add a point to that? That since that task force I mentioned in the 1990s, Walt, you would remember that, I'm sure. One of the things that came out of that task force was the 7 core themes of Catholic social teaching that we see now being used a lot in Catholic education. And I think that's been a real helpful thing. And I'm encouraged that a lot of Catholics, especially in Catholic schools and in many catechetical programs, are at least being exposed to these 7 core themes of Catholic social teaching. So I'm optimistic on that.
We have,
Go
ahead.
Bernie, related to that, I guess. I mean, I hear at times where, again, we have so many divisions within our church around these issues that some people will almost be kind of dismissive or have a certain judgment about, oh, you're one of those social justice Catholics, as somehow that somehow is different from other Catholics.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, how did we get there? I mean, how did we get to this place where some in our church don't see Catholic social teaching, social justice as core to being Catholic, as much as sacraments and so many other aspects of our church life?
Well, I think one of the paths that has taken us here is that we don't always recognize that our faith is about our entire life, and that what happens when we come to celebrate the Eucharistic liturgy, that has to lead us out into society to create a world that more closely reflects God's love and mercy, God's justice and peace. That separation between our faith and our daily living makes it difficult for people to see that our faith calls us to be active in social justice activities. And that's difficult for them to see because they're not seeing that their whole life, daily life, is to be reflecting their faith. And I would just add that I think our preaching, Father Walter Brueggemann did so well on that. Did I have that right, Brueggemann? No.
Burkhart.
Burkhart, thank you. Father Burkhart did such a beautiful job on that, and Father Ray Kemp, and others helping us to see that for preachers, that's a connection that has to be made. Not just shouting out about social justice issues out there, but connecting the word to our lives. That has to be done well. If we can do that well, that's one little way in which that connection can be made, and people will be less defensive when they hear the term social justice. You know, it's interesting to me that, and I keep hearing this in parishes, that they have to be careful of using the word social justice or not have the committee named the Social Justice Committee. But not long ago, I saw a commercial on television for one of these companies that traces your ancestry, like Ancestry.com. I'm not sure if it was that one, but one like it, that showed a person who traced her ancestry to Guatemala. And there she was so surprised to find out that her great-great-grandfather was a judge who worked hard to bring social justice to the poor in that country. Yeah. That commercial was using the term social justice, and yet in many of our Catholic settings, we shy away from using that.
All right, well, we are at the 1:31, so we thank you, Bernie, for giving us your time.
Actually, can we have time for one more question from Bob Stewart?
Yeah,
sure.
Dr. Evans, I appreciate your comment about expanding our understanding of pro-life, and that's very understandable. But what about expanding our understanding of a direct attacks on life? It seems to me a separation of children is is a direct attack. Strong opposition to health care for everyone. Seems like to me that's a direct attack because health care protects and saves life. Those are just two examples. I'm sure there are others. But it seems to me, I mean, this is just rumbling around in my head. Yes, we need to expand the understanding of being pro-life to include all those things you've mentioned. But it seems to be we get hung up on, well, these are direct attacks and these are more important.
I think you make a very good point. When we use the words direct attack out of Catholic social teaching and with the bishop's document, it's almost always with reference to killing, to ending somebody's life. And so there is that difficulty then in applying it to the denial of health care. But I do agree with you. I hear your point. The denial of health care or separation of children from parents at the border undoubtedly leads to a diminishment of the quality of life for people, and may, and certainly with regard to healthcare, may in fact lead to the death of many people. I think you make a very good point. I appreciate that.
If I could make just one other quick comment, Bernie. You know, I think that since having worked for the bishops for a long time, many of them are not very steeped in Catholic social teaching. Why? Because they came from the clergy, and the clergy aren't well formed. So it's kind of a feeder system. And so unless they get exposed to it really well, they really don't understand it. I think that's where some of the moral confusion comes from. They don't know the moral theology well enough to be able to articulate it, in my mind, in a proper way.
I think that's right, Walt. Thanks. I appreciate that.
All right, we'll let you go, Bernie, before, because I'm sure we can keep, we're not afraid to use the word social justice and Holy Trinity, so we could talk about with you all afternoon. So
Keep doing what you're all doing. You're a great example to other parishes. Believe me, I envy you.
Yeah.
Well, we are glad to spend this time with you.
Thank you, Bernie.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bernie. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.